See the first slide there. Susan, I thank you for hosting this, now the third webinar. And I guess for everybody that's out there, I would like to encourage you to look back. The first webinar was a very good webinar, just discussing what EBVs have done in Australia, and adding that as a selection tool to increase their overall national production of lamb there. And Dr. Ken Andrews, I see Ken's on here tonight, he gave a very good goat presentation as well last week, basically on a similar topic with what kind of potential NSIP can have for the goat industry. So I think I was nominated to give this talk today from Reed for a few reasons. Nominated, elected, volunteered, I'm not quite sure which it was. I do run a smaller flock, but I bother Dr. Notter quite a bit about asking a lot of random questions to make sure that I'm collecting data appropriately. One of the keys that we'll talk about tonight is contemporary groups, and I'm running a smallish flock. I'm really careful to make sure I try to get the best possible contemporary groups I can. And even though I raised Shropshires, I took some wool data this year, and throughout this presentation I'll have a couple different photos. Some are kind of tongue-in-cheek, hoping to laugh. I'm not always comfortable listening to myself talk for an hour. Maybe it won't be in an hour, but hopefully you'll get some of the jokes, I suppose. So the topic tonight, how, when, and what data to collect. See if we can move that forward. So 5 different discussion topics today. This evening, the NSIP production data collection table. This is a table I compiled. We'll go over that. Understanding contemporary groups and how to optimize them. I've got about a third of the presentation here. We'll be talking about these contemporary groups. I do have one slide on there's some links which I think Susan said you guys will be able to access the URLs that I put into the presentation here. There's just some good information that's online that can help explain some of the stuff that I may not go into as far as what all the EBVs are, and that will be discussed as well in the last webinar with the producer panel. Then the basic data that can be collected, when it should be collected, and the EBVs that will result, and then another slide about additional data that can be collected. Some of the stuff we'll talk here will not apply to everybody. I'm trying to do quite a bit of research on how to collect and submit wool data. I got some information from a few of the folks out west that do some more of that collecting, and also did a little bit of work looking into fecal egg counts, which is something that I'm not familiar with. So that'll be discussed here in a little bit. And just so you know, the one thing, I've got a few notes here that I'm going to try and reference back and forth between the presentation on my 2 computers. There is a lot of information on these slides. I tend to overdo it with information, but I figure you guys are all sitting in front of your computer. You'll be able to see it, and this table is your big bit of information to start with. This NSI, and please do ask questions in the chat boxes if anybody has any. This week in planning for the presentation, I had a lot of discussion with Dr. Notter, John Carlson, and Mary Sorensen about date ranges. Throughout 4 or 5 years ago, when we made the transition to have our NSIP data run by Sheep Genetics, or Lamb Plan in Australia, we basically took a system that we had set up in NSIP with specific age ranges that Dr. Notter had set up that were appropriate for the different production systems. And we're starting to work that into Lamb Plan software, be it Pedigree Master or Pedigree Wizard, that people submit data to. And Lamb Plan has some different dates that they prefer. So you're going to notice in this table here, I've got 3 columns and some different categories. So basically, when we're going to talk about taking measurements, there's going to be different time frames. Be it when they're at birth, at weaning, an early post-weaning measurement, post-weaning yearling hogget, and we have additional 4 adult categories. You'll notice the first column there, that's the NSIP recommendations. You can enter data outside of those recommended date ranges and collect data there, but ideally, to get the best possible contemporary groups, you kind of want to focus on that. That second column there, will show the lamb plan guidelines for age ranges, and they base their guidelines on the average age of a contemporary group. So you see that they have a slightly bigger window on some items, quite a bit of a bigger window on other items, or on other categories. And then the third column there with days listed is what Pedigree Master allows. I was working with a producer earlier this week where all along we were trying to plug in 9 years worth of his data. He's on here tonight, and we were trying to fit into the NSIP guidelines, and as a result we were breaking up some different weigh groups, and I learned this week that it would be best to probably just keep them in under the lamb plan guidelines. We would keep one big contemporary group. Off to the right you see the different categories, whether it's live weight, ultrasound for carcass merit with muscle and fat depth, fleece straight, scrotal circumference, and worm egg counts. And in the lower right, you will notice which breed groups or sheep type groups or goats each of these EBVs will be generated for. So with that, this is a good reference. It's something that while I was working on a few things this week, I actually just typed that out, and I've got it sitting here on my desk. And that might be advisable that when you're trying to develop your contemporary groups. With that, let's cover contemporary groups, because they are there's kind of a couple different keystones with EBVs, and one of them is developing good contemporary groups. Contemporary group is a set of animals that are managed and fed the same within a specified age range. Yeah, Raphael, this will be available for later reference. Susan's recording it. To help develop a contemporary group, ideally you have different sires represented within the same group, and that's what's going to allow for your genetic comparisons. Having two rams, the lambs from two rams competing against each other. Otherwise you're dealing with the variation in genetics on the ewes, which is more extensive, I guess. You don't have two specific similar sets of genetics comparing. As well, similar genetics represented in a different contemporary group, be that in different seasons, farms, production systems, feeding systems, management systems. Sharing rams across different farms allows NSIP to compare genetics across different environments, seeing how different animals perform in different environments. And then I guess one of the big keys here is properly designed contemporary groups will increase EBV accuracy. Conversely, poorly designed and not as optimum contemporary groups will decrease accuracy. So contemporary groups will continue on here. Planning an optimum contemporary group can start when breeding groups and dates are planned. This is something that I do, and I'm going to kind of run through an example of what I do in some of the next slides. But when you're putting bucks in and when you're planning how you're going to breed your ewes, you can start to think ahead as to how your contemporary groups are going to lay out the following lambing season or kidding season. And there's some considerations to make. Again, make sure that you have at least 2 sires represented per group to provide for that competition. Ideally, you want to have at least 15 lambs sired by each of those rams, or bucks, I should say. And as well, when in a following breeding season, it would be good to carry on similar genetics. This is point number 3 here, where say you use a ram in the fall of 2012, you should follow up with him or a similar ram of similar genetics the following year, so you have that like genetics from year to year. That's going to help you adjust over seasons. And then there's a couple things to keep in mind as well. When you're calculating kind of what you want your contemporary groups to be, you might have lambs that you may not submit data on, whether they got sick or injured, or if you're selling some light lambs into an ethnic trade or 4-H kids. So that is data that actually you wouldn't get a good data set on. And then wethers are also placed in a different contemporary group, which should be considered. Right now you don't code rams and wethers separate in the system. They're all called male sheep, and the wethers are indicated by a different contemporary group when you enter the data. That's something that Dr. Notter mentioned that Lamb Plan is a little bit sympathetic to. Historically, NSIP had used different adjustment factors, but within the lamb plan software, we can't enter wethers and rams separately. I'm not sure if that'll be changing, but it's something that they're aware of. So, one thing that you'll learn through the presentation, I'm not shy to talk about some of my failures in life. Not that a poorly designed contemporary group is a failure, but you know, I planned and I didn't succeed. And here you show the plan of what I did last fall. And again, I have a smaller flock. I breed mature ewes and yearling ewes separately. But I do try to make sure I at least have 15 lambs per sire in each of my breeding groups. And you'll see here I use 3 rams on the mature ewes, 15 to one, 12 to another, 13 to another, and I'm anywhere from, my anticipated lambs born per sire was 20 to 25. Generally that should be well more than what I would need to make that 15 lambs per minimum. And you'll notice, I do breed my ewe lambs. I know every year I'm not going to have a good contemporary group on those because I just don't keep enough ewe lambs to create a good contemporary group. So, and with that, you see my quote at the bottom, sheep don't read spreadsheets, because the plan wasn't as successful as I had hoped. It was still all right, but it didn't work as well. And there were some variations to the plan. After I bred the ewes, I had somebody interested in some bred ewes, and I sold 5 of them out of the 2 younger rams. So basically, if I go back here, well, actually I'll show this in a bit, but out of that 12005 ram was 1 ewe sold, and then 4 ewes out of the 12007. I had 1 mature ewe didn't settle in the first breeding, and you may have noticed there I have a pretty tight window for breeding. It's about 23 to 25 days that I try and do my drops within. So I had 1 ewe that she didn't settle on the first breeding, so she ended up, all those ewes get exposed again to the ewe lambs later. And I had 4 lambs dropped out of the contemporary groups due to sickness and injury, and the sheep didn't read the spreadsheets. So this is the results. And you'll see what we ended up with as far as number of ewes bred to each of those rams under the mature ewe. I don't know if you can see my cursor. I don't think you can. If somebody can see my cursor, say yes. You don't all have to at once. Thanks, Raphael. So basically on that first line up there, the 5815 ram, he ended up with a 200% lambing percentage. And you'll notice at the bottom there were some comments and conclusions here. That 5815 ram got bred to all of the older ewes, which you would anticipate, they should have a better lambing percentage. So I got 30 live lambs out of him. That's a good contemporary group. The 12005 ram, he had a lower lambing percentage than expected, and with 16 live lambs, and then 2 of them, either sick or injured, got thrown out. So I only ended up with 14 lambs in that contemporary group, 1 less than what is preferred. Draw or use arrows to point things. Menu at top. Ooh, look at that. All right. Thanks, Susan. The 12007 ram, he's the one that I sold a bunch of ewes to. 14 live lambs. I had to throw 2 of them out of the data set, which left 12 lambs in the contemporary group. Now, I don't castrate at all. All my rams are left whole, so that wasn't a consideration I had to make. But as you can see here, with 14 being that optimum 15 being the optimum benchmark, I had 2 of my groups were subpar there, or sub-ideal. And a couple things, I mentioned on these late drop ewes, the contemporary group wasn't going to be ideal from the get-go, but based on what I had planned, I actually had higher lambing percentages. I try not to flush my ewe lambs. I'm hoping for singles out of them, but over here, 3, 6, and 2 is a pretty. That is cool, Susan. It's a very small contemporary group, but it is a full data set at the same time. And one of the things that I didn't consider, which is what resulted in the 150% lambing percentage on some of those younger ewes, pumpkins are actually pretty darn good feed. The ewes were on pumpkins at the time, which you'll see at the end of the slide. So they had a higher percentage there, but still not even close to enough to get up to a good contemporary group. Oh, Bill, the two numbers after the QR, those are OPP susceptibility genetic markers. Some of the work that's been going on out in Clay Center. So the big point here for contemporary groups, correct, Bill, TMEM154. Thank you. The big thing is to have a plan, and two stories that I can relate to this week. I was working with a gentleman on the call tonight, Don Knapp, and Don's kind of like me, really likes to collect a lot of production data. He's done it over the years, and we took those 9 years of data this week, and we've been trying to fit them into the Pedigree Master system. And there were times where some of his contemporary groups got split due to age ranges. And he had mentioned that, I wish I had known 10 years ago when I was collecting this data what I was going to be doing with it now. So having a plan is a key. Another gentleman who I don't think is on the webinar tonight, who is joining NSIP this year, he made a similar statement as I've been talking to him when he gets his Suffolks on about the different time frames and age ranges that he should take measurements on. He said, this is good, this adds a structure and adds a plan to how I collect my production data. So that's a key. I'm going to see if I can get this guy moved out of the way for now. One of the things that helps me in planning for contemporary group date planning is Excel. Now I do a lot of Excel work throughout the day. My day job is I've got one really big screen in front of me and one smaller screen in front of me, and I'm used to using Excel quite a bit. And Excel can do a good job of subtracting if you've got a weaning weigh date and a birth date. Subtracting those numbers, you can actually get your day of age very easily. Conversely, you can take a date in which an animal is born, and if you want to, say you want to wean when that oldest lamb is, or take a weaning weight when that oldest lamb is 75 days of age, you can add the date plus 7, take the date and add 75, and it'll give you the date which you want to target your weights. And off to the right, this might be something you want to come back to and look at. This is an example of when my lambs were born this year. Both the earlier drop, oops, my arrow is now stuck. The earlier drop lambs, all right, we're going to leave the arrow there, 1401 to 1461. You'll kind of see what I chose to take that weaning date and some calculations for that below. I targeted a 75-day weaning weight, and that date would have been April 16th. However, one of the things I do is I kind of tweak. I'll look at when my target dates are, and I'll also look at when the data runs are. Twice a month we can submit data all month long to Sheep Genetics to Lamb Plan, and twice a month they will run an evaluation for EBVs on that data. So instead of weighing on April 16th, which was the day after the data submission, I weighed on April 14th, which was the day of, I guess the 16th was Tuesday, 2 days later. And April 14th allowed me to collect the data, enter the data into the system, and send it off so that I'm not curious for the next 3 months on what my EBVs were going to be. So that, I do make some tweaks on that. Well, Susan, for how much age can vary, and if I can scoot back real quick, I didn't cover that on the earlier slide, but I should have. Based on the Lamb Plan guidelines, that age variance is 42 days. That's the number I have in parentheses in the third column for those younger weights, and then 70 days on the older weights. NSIP has always preferred a little bit of a tighter window with 35 days. So that's basically the duration of that contemporary group. And Lamb Plan will automatically break those contemporary groups if they are over 42 days in length. So. Scoot forward again. Excellent. So again, I made similar decisions on when I intend to ultrasound. The target date for me was June 30th, but I'm probably going to do that actually on June 27th so that the ultrasound technician has time to measure the images, get them back to me so that they can get entered into the system. So some additional thoughts here on contemporary groups. As I mentioned earlier, less than optimal contemporary groups will lead to lower EBV accuracy. It's important to consider, and this is a discussion that I can relate that we had last week Friday. If your flock is too small to develop ideal contemporary groups with 2 sires, some production information is better than none. And in talking to Dave Notter about this, because I wanted to make sure that he was comfortable with what I was saying, he said the goal is whole flock recording. As far as he was concerned, a contemporary group of 2 is still data, especially if that is the 2 that you have. And for producers that are used to doing adjusted weights, their adjusted weights are good. It's good to be taking that production information, but EBVs are a more accurate estimate of performance ability, simply because pedigree performance is included and it can adjust for environmental influences. And for people with smaller flocks, even though you may have with suboptimal contemporary groups, EBVs are still going to be a better option than adjusted weights. And the way the system works, it gives you some excellent benchmarking and tracking tools about your within flock performance. We have 1 sire in larger temporary groups. Susan, I believe, maybe Bill's answering that, but I believe large and small is kind of relative, but in general, I would say that if you're going to have rams that'll produce 2 rams that'll produce 10 lambs each, or 1 ram that'll produce 20, you're going to be better off with 2 rams, because then you have that genetic competition between the 2 rams. Bill, they can give that information the way, and I'll get into that a little bit later, but for ultrasound technicians, the way we've done it here in Wisconsin is a little different than most. We save the images and we measure them later. So, and Todd Taylor and I are both certified technicians, so I'm going to do the UW sheet this year, and Todd will do mine. And, I was going to mention in the Schropp board meeting last Friday, there was a question when we were talking about contemporary groups, and one of my producer friends says, well, yeah, but a lot of these, we were talking about encouraging youth to join NSIP, and he had a concern about contemporary groups, and I made that statement then that some data is better than none, and at least if you can start thinking how you can develop those better contemporary groups, we still do want them to participate. So, the online resources. This is going a little quicker than I thought, everybody. So if you've got questions to ask, please do. You can do it right in the machine. It has the capability. Yeah, Bill, we use an Aloka that does not have actually the little tracking balls, a little gummed up. So it makes it a lot easier for us to just save the images. So here I've got a list, and this is really, I put this in here as something that you can reference back to, and when this with this presentation being recorded, I wanted to put a few links in here. The first 2 go to 2 different sections in the NSIP website, and they will link to additional, in the lower right-hand corners of each of these pages, there's additional notes and tools that are very, when you get into them, they are very helpful. It's a lot of reading. I spent a lot of time reading up on these. And the new one that came out just earlier this week for anybody that's on NSIP, there's a Pedigree Master Manual that John Carlson and Mary Sorensen took a tremendous amount of effort and time to develop. And I do know, talking to Don, who I helped earlier this week, he said he used that manual as a guide, and he said it was actually very helpful. So if you are new to Pedigree Master or interested in NSIP, that'll be a good tool to reference. And the last 2 links that I have here, they're specifically for lamb plan, so there's some caution there that everything that they recommend there might be some slight differences with what we do with NSIP, but things like visual scoring, there's some good information, and if you like collecting data and if you've got different things you want to look at, there are some possibilities there. I'm going to take a peek what Bill wrote here. Oh, Randall, how do you handle stats on ewes that adopted a lamb or had one of their lambs adopted off? There is a section in there where you can graft a ewe, where you note if you have a lamb that's grafted onto another ewe. And I'm not sure how the statistics happen behind it, but you can record it in Pedigree Master. If Dr. Notter's on, he might be able to address statistically how that's handled in the system. But there is a way for you to actually record it. Okay, so data to collect, and similar to contemporary groups, weights are obviously a keystone to EBVs. And birth weights, I am very aware that a lot of people don't take birth weights, especially in some more extensive programs. They can be easy to take if it works in your system. It's one of my wife's favorite times of the years where she gets to see me put the little lambs in the bucket and hang them up after I've dipped their navels. And I don't ear tag right away at birth, but if I do have, say I've got 2 twin ewe lambs or triplet lambs that are all the same sex, I'll put a little mark on them in iodine, and that way I'll know who's who and be able to relate back any like birth weights later on when I do the ear tagging. So yeah, Paul, I don't know about the ET either. Additional ideas sometime. Thanks, Bill, for the link. Bottle-fed lambs should be dropped because they really don't. You don't want their performance affecting their dam, considering it's not their dam feeding him. Okay. So if your management system doesn't allow a simple opportunity to collect birth weights, really don't worry about it. I've had a lot of people just be worried that, well, I can't collect birth weights, so I shouldn't do NSIP. That's not true. When I had my flock in California, I did not take birth weights. My EBVs turned out fine when I had my subsequent weaning weights and post-weaning weights. So regardless of whether you're on NSIP or not, a good scale and handling system is a great long-term investment. I'm pretty sure most everybody on listening to this knows that. As mentioned, I've got a smaller flock. I'll drop anywhere from 70 to 100 lambs in a year. And the last couple of times I weighed, I was making sure that I was tracking because I knew I had this presentation coming, and I can weigh 100 lambs in an hour. So the time investment isn't that much. I do tend to weigh probably more than most people do. I've got a little project where I'm looking at feed efficiency this year. And I will admit that the more times those lambs go to shoot, the easier it gets every time, because they start to know what's going on and they know where the exit is. Bill, bottle fed can be put in a separate contemporary group, but as far in my discussions with Dr. Notter earlier, at least for the weaning information shouldn't be put in. You can put them back in after weaning into an early post-weaning contemporary group. Yeah, you can definitely go back and change things. I actually did that just this last week, where I had some information, which I will talk about a little later, that I was advised to remove from the system, because it was, I've always been under the opinion that more data is better, but that is not quite an accurate statement in every scenario. So yes, you can go back and change things in Pedigree Master. It actually makes it pretty easy. The one thing that, and if Mary's on here, I'll make sure to mention you don't want to change any IDs if you have old data in the system, because that can goof some things up. But as far as performance information, you can change it very easily. So there's some basics to what you're going to collect. Of course, parentage, pretty sure that's going to be obvious for everybody. Birth date if you can, the type of birth, and the rearing type. You also record all open ewes, dead and aborted lambs. Yeah, Lisa, dropping would mean that you put the animals in as far as being born and their birth date, but you do not enter a weaning weight for them. That's how I was referring to that. Birth weights, obviously taken in pounds. Weaning weights are also taken in pounds, and you've got a range of 40 to 120 days. That's per the lamb plan recommendation. Ideally, for NSIP, we recommend tightening that window a little bit from 42 to 90. By keeping them 30 days younger, you have a greater influence on being able to judge the milking ability of that ewe. When you get out to 120 days, your ability to judge the milking ability of those ewes is, you've got other factors coming into play, I guess. Oftentimes the weaning weight is referred to as a 60-day weight. You do not need to wean the lambs at the time you take that weight. In general, I always take my weaning weight about a week before I separate the ewes and the lambs. And something that Dave and I talked quite a bit about was how you manage some of the more extensively managed flocks and their weaning weights, because a lot of them are going to wean after 120 days. This is going to be some of the Western range flocks, potentially some of the forage-based flocks. And in that case, if you're not going to be weighing within a 40 to 120 day window, or if you're going to be weighing at 110 to 130 days, you're going to want to take a look and see what makes the best contemporary group. Those extensively managed flocks can enter their weaning weights under the early post-weaning category. And again, that refers back to the table we had on slide 3, I believe it was. So just because it says weaning weight, that doesn't have to be the category you enter weaning weight in. Ultimately, what you want to do is make a best fit for the age of those lambs when they're weighed and the category that they would fall in to make the best contemporary group. I believe the age of range will be the same with goats. There might be some nuances, and if Dr. Andres is still on, he might be able to answer Charmin's question about the age range. Should be the same in goats, but if there's something that I don't know, thanks, Ken. Ken will share it there. So, I didn't mean to bring the arrow back in. I was stuck before. Sorry about that. So these basic information that we take on birth and weaning is relevant for all breeds. And the EBVs that you'll generate are birth weight, weaning weight, maternal weaning weight, that relates to milk, your numbers of lambs born, and your numbers of lambs weaned. Some of these data points will influence other traits. Even having, I have submitted, sometimes I will submit data when I only have my lambing information and no weaning weights, simply because it gives me an extra time to check and say, all right, did I enter all this data incorrectly, and I can change it if needed. And I have noticed differences in EBVs on twin ram lambs that have a pound of differences in post-weaning weight EBVs when there was a pound of difference in the birth weight. And interestingly, when you follow those through, those estimates are almost always very, very close to accurate. It definitely shows the difference, the value of an increased birth weight as far as growth goes. Thanks, Ken. So after weaning weights, there are 3 pre-adult categories. That's early post-weaning, and yearling. That early post-weaning runs, and that can be the weaning weight for some extensively managed flocks. Early post-weaning is going to range 80 to 240 days. That is, generally we prefer 91 to 150 there, but within the system it will allow you to go up to 240 days. And generally early post-weaning, you're going to find that with some of the more intensively fed, whether you're a Midwestern farm flock that's creep feeding your lambs all along, or maybe you're maybe not creep feeding the lambs, but as those lambs come off the ewes at 60 to 90 days, you're putting them onto a grain feeding. That's generally what that early post-weaning category is going to work for. The post-weaning category is definitely for those more forage-based flocks. In yearlings, it can work as an additional category, and you can record some other traits that we'll cover towards the end here on wool and fecals. But one thing to be cautious of on yearlings is by the time your lambs get to that age, or your yearlings get to that age, more than likely you've done quite a bit of culling already. And so now you're taking data on the top end of your sheep, and you have less performance variance based on the genetic differences in those animals. So you always want to be a little bit careful with some of the yearling information. And that's the story I can relate to Dave Nodder. This year, when I sheared I grew up 4 yearling rams this last year. And when I sheared them, I had the ultrasound machine, and I did take some ultrasound measurements on them. And after talking to Dave, he was very, I don't know, not adamant, but he said you should not enter that data. And because I have a yearling ultrasound information on those, but it's only on 4 lambs. They've already been selected for, 4 yearlings. The bottom end's already been culled out. So I'm showing a variation in measurements on a pretty similar set of animals that were already selected as keepers. So with these categories, taking weights on these animals, they are all each category is highly correlated with growth. So I'm going to check out the questions here real quick. Yeah, Alice, I've got a friend in Connecticut that sells a lot of lambs into the Eastern market, and you would be able, obviously you wouldn't be able to take, if you're selling lambs in the Eastern market at 40 to 50 pounds, you wouldn't be able to take an early post-weaning measurement. You would need to sit down and do some calculations on when your lambs are born and when you're going to be selling those lambs, and figure out if you can take some valid weaning weight information. And if we go back here, your weaning weight, your weaning age is going to be that 40 or 42 to 90, down to 40 pounds. So if you're selling your lambs when, hopefully you get at least a bunch of them above that 40-day age range, you can take weights, consider them weaning weights, even though the lambs are probably still on the ewes, and that at least will give you a lot of the maternal traits. The balance of the group is weighed. Hi Dale, good to see you. You can enter that weight, but with that weight, that lamb, if you enter the weight of a lamb before the rest of them are weighed 10 days later, you essentially have a contemporary group of 1. So you can definitely do it. I actually have an example of a flock out in California that I help a friend out there do some stuff, and he's got a ram that was born in December versus the rest of them in January. And that's something that I didn't mention, and I should. Right now, and this is something that I think is going to be changing soon, at calendar January 1, no matter what, lamb plan splits the contemporary group. It starts a new contemporary group for you. And my friend in California, his average lambing time had been about January 1, so automatically his contemporary groups are cut in half. He has one yearling ram that he grew out that's born in December, the balance of them in January and February, and his accuracies on that one yearling are much lower than the rest, simply because he was his own contemporary group. So hopefully that answers your question. If there's a way to adjust his weight for that plus 10 days, I don't know if you can do that accurately, but that would be another option, I suppose. Carcass traits. So Bill jumped on me on this one. He got a little ahead, but he asked some good questions. So we have done a change here in NSIP. Well, previously we didn't offer very many carcass traits. It was only available on Suffolk's prior to the change to Lamb Plan. Lamb Plan had a lot more data. By that time we had a lot of adjustments we could actually put into the system. So now we do have carcass traits available on all breeds. The ultrasound measurements are best taken at early post-weaning, or yearling ages. They're best taken on animals when they're nearest the weight that would be harvested. And ultrasound measurements need to be accompanied with body weight measurements. So when you're taking your early post-weaning or when you're taking your post-weaning measurement, that is the time, or very close to that time, is when you would want to ultrasound. One thing to be aware of with the terminal sire breeds, the lambs must be a minimum of 66 pounds for their data to be entered. And another note, similar to directly applying to the scenario I gave on my 4 yearlings, those ultrasound dates prior to the yearling category will offer better contemporary groups. When you take ultrasound measurements on yearlings, you've already culled out a lot of animals. So the earlier you can do that, or when you have a larger contemporary group, the better that information is going to be. As I mentioned, EBVs are available for all breeds. Excuse me. And I assume they do it the same in Canada. I know in the UK they take the measurement at a different location. They take it after the 13th rib. Here in the States we've always done between the 12th and 13th rib. And we do loin depth and fat thickness. Depth is a highly correlated measurement to loin area. It's an easier measurement to obtain. You don't necessarily need to shear the lambs for depth, where generally you do if you're going to take an area measurement. So we have gone with depth, and it takes some people some rethinking to try and look at a depth measurement as compared to an area measurement. But with a high correlation factor and the ease of measurement, it is the right way to go. Good point, Lisa. I think Chris Schauer will probably cover the statement that you made there, but at this time, lamb plan isn't set up to handle 2 lambings in 1 year. And as Lisa mentions, this should be changing. I know Dr. Notter's been working closely with lamb plan to adjust that for some of our accelerated flocks that are on lamb plan. Thanks, Lisa, for pointing that out. I provide a couple more links here. Dave Notter put together a very good reference sheet for scanning. And there's a little tiny note at the bottom there that if any of these documents change the way the website's set up right now, I think we'll lose the link. So if you can't find these documents at a future time, go to the NSIP website and you'll be able to find them under one of the categories, under one of the headings. So Chris Schauer, I'm not sure if Chris is on here, but Chris and Todd Taylor and I serve as the ultrasound committee for NSIP, and we are proposing that starting January 1st, 2016, that all ultrasounds are done by a certified technician. We're working on a few things to put that recommendation in front of the board, and hopefully we'll get that figured out soon. And you'll note there that there's a list of certified ultrasound technicians, and should anybody out there have technicians that they work with that are not on this list, have them contact us. You'll notice there is a certification program a week from today at Iowa State, but we can try and set up some other opportunities if needed. Thanks, Bill, for sharing the difference in Genovis and what we do here in the States. Thanks, Alice. So adult weights, that was something that I wanted to cover. It's something that Reed and Dave Notter and I have talked about quite a bit lately. Currently we don't have EBVs for adult weights, but it is something that, in talking to Dave, I think we're going to be seeing those adjustment factors inputted into the system soon, that we can generate that. I know that's personally something that I'm interested in. You'll note the first line there, that's selection for increased post-weaning growth. Generally increases body size, which does result in higher maintenance cost. Faster growing sheep will tend to be bigger sheep. And if we want to reduce our maintenance costs and have a more efficient sheep, we probably still want them to grow. And there's a high correlation between growth at all stages. So it's a tough thing to select for increased post-weaning weight and a decreased mature size. But we can't do it unless we have the data in the system. And you'll notice here that I make the statement at the bottom that the Western Range Index, which is an index primarily used by Targhis and the Columbias and Rambouillets that are on, that index actually puts a positive emphasis on post-weaning growth, but a negative emphasis on hogget weights. So that tries to moderate that mature size and adjust for that. Personally, I think as far as the industry goes, it's a good thing to be paying attention to. I take, oops, no, sorry, got too far ahead of me. I do take measurements when I put bucks in the fall. That seems to be a good time. You don't have to, the ewes have adjusted back from weaning. They're generally at a more stable weight than they would be at other times. So that seems to me to be a good time to be taking those weights, and I guess I'd encourage other people to start doing that, because soon we will all have access to EBVs for those. Now the spot showing to get a good image. Oh, Lisa, you don't want to ask me that question. I ultrasounded a hair sheep once, and it was one of the more awful experiences I ever had. We couldn't get an image on it. I don't ultrasound it. That would have been 10 years ago. And we actually, I think what we had was we had air in the hair follicles on the hair sheep, and we could not penetrate that with the ultrasound machine. If Chris is on, if he has any experience with hair sheep, I'd appreciate if you could share that on the ultrasound side of things. I do see the question from Susan about the difference between a yearling and a hogget. They're very similar in age, but slightly different. Basically, the yearling is going to be about 10 to 14 months, and the hogget 14 to 19. And as far as technicians certified with hair sheep, right now the technicians are certified on wool sheep, but we do not discriminate between hair and wool. We're equal opportunity ultrasound technicians, and goats as well. 4 or 5. Oh, thank you, Paul. Paul, for those that don't know, Paul Lewis runs Dorpers. And he does have a very good technician that ultrasounds for him. And he says he does have a problem on maybe 4 or 5 out of 250. So as long as we can get through and get those images, that's a good thing. Just wondering if there were any advances in imaging or not. Part of it is, I think, Lisa, what you're asking there is, mentioning there is he shears to take the ultrasound measurement, and you really don't need to shear anymore if we're just taking depth, but for everybody that still wants an area measurement, you really need to, it's best to take a shear spot out of those lambs to get that full image. But you're probably referring to hair sheep too, so I'm not sure there. Okay, thank you everybody. Sorry, lost my track here, reading too many questions. All right, on to wool. And I'm not sure if we have too many Western Range folks on or not. If we do, please correct me if I make any misstatements, because wool is not my forte. But you'll notice here that we have 5 different traits that we can generate EBVs on. Fleece weight is obviously a pretty simple one. Micron, correct me if I'm wrong on anything here. And then the additional ones, fiber diameter coefficient of variance, and fiber curvature and staple length. Generally, those are all done by submitting samples to wool labs. That is something I did for the first time this year. I did notice I had a ram with a very different fleece, so I was curious, and I took samples on all my yearling ewes and all my stud bucks, basically. And I did find, based on the genetics and the influence of that ram on his progeny, that they all had greater fiber curvature. They are finer in diameter, and they also had a shorter fleece length, staple length, and a lower fleece weight. Haven't entered that into lamb plan because I don't have a spot for it for terminal sires, but it was a fun task. you know, just mostly for curiosity's sake. And to go through, to actually read up on these specific EBVs, the Western Range Genetic Valuation Notebook, which I have the link there, is a very good one that helps explain those. And wool data can be collected at various points between post-weaning and 5 years of age, but it is, sorry, I'll get the arrow out of there, it is important to note that the EBV is only generated on data that's submitted for the yearling, the hogget, and then the first recorded adult fleece weight. So if you record a yearling and a hogget, which it'll kind of be, you'll probably, what you're doing there is breaking up two contemporary groups because they're a similar age, depending on the age ranges that you're shearing. And then if you take a 2-year-old, 3-year-old, and 4-year-old fleece, it's only that 2-year-old fleece weight or fleece data that is going to work into the calculation of the EBV. If you skip the 2-year-old and do a 4 and 5, then it'll use the 4-year-old fleece weight. And it is noted in the Western Range Genetic Evaluation Notebook that you can store the additional data, even though if you enter 3, 4, and 5 years old data, it'll only use that first one. You can enter the rest of it in there, and you know, maybe someday they will start looking at additional years and, you know, potentially increasing the accuracy of those EBVs that much more. However, the wool traits are, the next statement here, wool traits are highly heritable. And even with just a single data submission, you get some pretty accurate EBVs. So that's something to note. And one thing I learned when I was reading in there, and I don't know if Chris was going to cover this when he talks about entering the data, but if you're putting your first wool data into the system, you need to provide an earlier shearing date so that the duration or the shearing interval can be calculated. And the other thing that I noted when I was actually, because I have been entering in fleece weights just for fun. I have been entering in fleece weights the last few years, but when you get into certain categories, and I believe it was the adult categories of 2-year-old, 3-year-old, 4-year-old, and 5-year-old, the breeding, the body weight that is entered needs to be the same date as the fleece weight that's entered. So you may need to get a little creative there. The way I did it is I enter my breeding weight as a fall date, and then 5 months, so 6, 7 months later, I come through and I take that fleece weight and I collect that data, but I plug it back into the fall weight, because generally those ewes that I bred in the fall are still going to be there that I shear. So there's, I hope that doesn't get too confusing, but there are some things that as you go into it, you may need to get creative on. Susan, we would love to have your technician to come out and certify on sheep, and I think the difference between sheep and goat would be somewhat negligible. So I do think, and I'd have to talk to Chris on this, but I do think that the sheep technicians would be approved for goats, and maybe that's something that Ken and you and I and Chris should talk about. We do not shear until yearling. Should we wait until 2 years to enter data? Actually, Judy, my thought with that would be enter your yearling data, because 2 data points will be better than 1. So if you enter your yearling data and then your 2-year data, you'll be able to get the 2 data points in there. And if you were going to submit data, if you're going to submit fleece samples, when you do that as yearlings, you'll probably have more yearlings there in that group than you would have of that 2-year-old group, because you'll probably cull some out, so you'll get a bigger contemporary group as well. There is some notes in that aforementioned Western Range notebook talking about the differences in fleece quality between different ages, but the range in quality is the same regardless of how old they are. So, Mike Korn, I saw you almost typing there, but I want to thank you for giving me the 3rd wool lab that I did not have on this list, but these are the wool labs that you can submit samples to. I worked, because there's a Shropshire breeder that works actually in the lab in San Angelo, I sent my samples down there, and that worked well, but I know a lot of people use Yoakum McCall, and I think a lot of the target breeders in Montana are going to use the Montana Wool Lab, so I provided contact information for each of those should you be interested. And so to maybe give you a little laugh, I showed you my homemade skirting table, which weighs the fleeces at the same time. It's a little bit small, but I hope you're all chuckling out there and not just shaking your heads. So, and we're down towards the end here on fecal egg counts. This is something I'm not as familiar with. I have not taken any fecal egg counts. I know a lot of the hair sheep breeders have been doing a lot of really good work with fecal egg counts, the Katahdin breed. And basically what we're doing here is we're going to evaluate the worm egg count and develop EBVs from that. It's a relatively, actually I don't specifically know the heritability of it, but I do know they've made a lot of progress with this in other countries. Thanks, Bill. The fecal egg count can be recorded at older ages, but the data is not calculated. You need to calculate this data at weaning, early post-weaning or post-weaning ages. That's when those lambs and sheep are going to be most susceptible to the worms. So that is the best time to collect that data. And there's a note here that if you say you collect the data at weaning and at post-weaning ages, it's the first set of data that you enter that is going to be used for the calculation. They're not going to use weaning and post-weaning fecal egg counts. So basically make sure that the first enter you data is the most representative. And can't remember. Oh yeah, there's Dave said I could share this, and I thought it was pretty interesting. He and Joan Burke at the USDA Research Center they've been doing some research. Well, Joan's been doing the research, and Dave's been helping them crunch some numbers on things. But what they've been doing is looking at fecal egg count in ewes that are about to lamb or have just lambed. And they're seeing some very good information. So it might be an opportunity down the road that the adult fecal egg counts could be used if collected right around lambing. And in talking to Dave, currently only the hair and polypay sheep have access to the EBVs for fecal egg counts, but Dave is going to provide access to everybody. Oh, Alice, I don't know the answer to your question. I do hope somebody does. I think the key, Alice, will be for consistency, whether it's 1 or 2 grams. Thank you, Susan. That's 1 gram. And Carrie, if people wormed at post-weaning weight lamb, is that taken into consideration? I assume you mean is that taken into consideration when you're doing a fecal egg count. I think the key there is to plan your deworming with when you're taking your fecal egg counts to make sure that those fecal egg counts make sense and are not influenced by a dewormer. And Ken, that's a good point, because that's something that I'm not sure. I don't know if Jim Morgan or any of the Katahdin people that do fecal egg counts are on tonight. Susan, there is a protocol for collecting samples. I don't exactly know what it is. And Ken, I don't think we require for NSIP for it to go through a specific lab. Something that Reed and I talked about just today, though, based on some conversations I had yesterday, is potentially looking into some different labs that could do fecal egg counts, kind of on an in-volume basis, partnering with NSIP so that we have a little bit more consistency. So that's something we just talked about today, and I'd like to talk to some more of the Katahdin breeders about that and learn a few more things about how we can help everybody collect this information. I think Bill and Susan Schultz, when I visited them last week, they were kind of intrigued, as I am, about the fecal egg counts, but there's gets to be only so much data you can handle yourself. So, you can learn to do fecal egg counts yourself, but what we were talking about there was to have an actual lab do the counts for us so we have some more consistency. Okay, so I think this is the third to last slide here. Optional data that can be collected is breeding dates. If you're using a marker on your rams, you can calculate, or you can enter the data for what might be clicked on eventually would be a gestation length EBV. It's something I always enter my breeding dates just because I have them. I don't get anything back for it, but maybe someday I'll get some gestation length EBVs. Lamb Plan offers a dystocia scoring. That as well is something that I enter into my pedigree master. I don't get anything back yet, but some point down the road we might. So if if you're taking those notes in your lambing barn, as I'm sure many, or kidding barn, and I'm sure many people are, there is a spot to record it. And I mentioned there that there is a within Pedigree Master. If you click on the lambing ease button, it'll give you a 1 through 5 scale of, I think 1 is unobserved and 5 was calling the vet. But that'll give you a range there. And then scrotal circumferences, that's something that I do, and I think there's quite a few people out there that do measure scrotal circumferences. You want to do that at early post-weaning or yearling. Generally, I find it's the best time to do it is when you're doing your ultrasounds. You don't want to do it on lambs at weaning, and you also might want to take into consideration that if you do them on yearlings, you have already culled out quite a few rams, I would expect. So early post-weaning and post-weaning are probably the best time frames. Okay, thanks, Paul. So you need, and Paul brings up a point there that gestation length is only available with AI or ET. And I'm guessing this is something that'll get covered by Chris Schauer, but you do have an option to mark whether your animals are serviced naturally by AI or by ET. So I guess it must be clicking AI or ET that'll trigger your gestation length. Ken, thank you very much for the link. That's perfect. And that'll help Mike out too with his question. So this is the second to last slide, and it's something that I wanted to put together to just kind of share what the time commitment really is. So I think a lot of people are overwhelmed by the thought of collecting production data. And for me, it's just something I've done for a long time, and I'm used to it. So I just I drew it out here. And at lambing time, I'm not doing anything different than I wouldn't do otherwise. So there, it's not any additional hours for me. To weigh anywhere from 50 to 100 to 80 lambs at weaning is going to take me an hour from setup, running the lambs into the corral, weighing them, and being done. And I write that down on a spreadsheet. I bring it up to the house, and I transfer it onto another spreadsheet, which can be uploaded into Pedigree Master. When I actually take early post-weaning measurements on my lambs, so that takes 50 minutes, and I make a note that the lambs go through the chute easier the second time around or third time around. Ultrasound's going to take me a couple hours once the technician's here. We get them set up. Just takes a little bit longer to handle each of those lambs. And then to enter all the data in, all of the data that I enter in, the pertinent data, so the lambing records, the weaning records, and the post-weaning and ultrasound measurements. That's what I view for a terminal sire flock. Those are kind of the critical things you really want to look at. It takes me about 3 hours now that I'm used to Pedigree Master. And the time required to study the results when you get your EBVs back is as long as you want. And I will tell a little bit of a joke here. And when we were in South Carolina, I went out to dinner with a couple of lamb ranching friends, one of which I'm going to check and see if he's on here, see if I can tease him. He's not on, so we'll tease him anyways. I was with one of my lamb ranchers, actually two of my lamb ranchers that I worked with for Nyman Ranch. We went out to dinner and with Richard Hamilton and his wife, and Richard and Clark Willis and I kept talking about NSIP, and finally Stacy asked, "What is NSIP?" And I turned to Stacy and I said, when Richard gets his bull catalogs and he gets all of his EBVs on bulls, and you don't see him for 3 days? She's like, "That's almost spot on." I'm like, well, that's kind of what NSIP is for sheep, because he studies those EBVs. And he wants to make sure he's making the right bull purchase, and that's what you get here coming back from NSIP, are the right EBV or are EBVs that you can study and make some decisions from. It's only one tool in the toolbox, but it is a tool and something that warrants paying attention to. So my total NSIP time, and I put more time in than needed, but my minimum time would be about just shy of 7 hours. And it took me a lot longer to put this PowerPoint together than the 7 hours to collect all the data. So my final comment there is start collecting the production data, because you can't enter it unless you have it. So I'm going to take a peek here at questions, because that's the point I am at here. This is the last slide. Yeah, you definitely don't change the ID, but if you have that are gone. If you there's a way to there's a status that you click within Pedigree Master, whether it's a cull animal, whether it's sold, whether it's dead, or whether it's current. So to indicate something's gone, you would mark it as a cull or dead, whichever is appropriate. The one time you do change the ID is on a lamb if it's a cull lamb. And I'm just going to kind of leave it at that, because I'm sure that's something Chris is going to cover about entering data. But by changing that ID on a cull lamb, you're not charged for the data processing fee on it. I thought I was going to end up at about 45 minutes, but it looks like I ended up going over an hour. Alice, you will enter you will change it to a CU before you submit your post-weaning weight. You can keep it as a CU for weaning, but it's before you submit that for post-weaning that you enter it as a CU. It's the post-weaning measurement that is going to trigger your charge for a data processing fee. Susan, how has NSIP improved my flock? I've got an interesting balance here, because I've got some very traditional Shropshires, and I had some, and those came from my friend in California, and then I had my family's flock, which were a little bit more moderate. And what I've been doing is trying to blend those into one uniform type of sheep, and I think definitely the EBVs have helped me identify the best performers in the flock, especially with the different genetics there. And it's definitely helped me, with people looking to buy rams as well. But I watch those numbers. I match up breeding pairs based on EBVs and pedigree, which generally the pedigree does follow the EBV for the most part. But it's been a fun tool to use, and one that I think with certainly flocks larger than me have a lot of opportunity with, because there's certainly a need out there to find productive sheep and productive rams to sell into the commercial market. And one of the big things that the NSIP board is working at is trying to connect those dots. Oh, Paul, sheep love pumpkins, and Paul knows where my original sheep came from. They came from Petaluma, from Fred Groverman. Fred's son actually runs a pumpkin patch, so the Groverman ewes knew right what to do, and my ewes learned pretty quickly. They tend to eat a hole into them, get to the seeds, and once they're done with the seeds, all they leave is stems. They do eat the whole thing. Or would it be better not to enter the data? Riddell, absolutely. It's better if you have a broken leg. You enter the lamb as being born, but you don't enter any weaning information on them. Or if the lamb breaks its leg after weaning, then you don't enter any post-weaning information on them. Kerry, he had a large scrotal circumference when he got measured. Susan, I have a person that I used to shear for a long time, and I didn't know if it's an old wives' tale, but she always said that pumpkins are a great dewormer. She didn't have all that much experience with them, but she had heard it somewhere. And this was, 15, 20 years ago I had heard that. So I find it interesting that they're actually looking at it now. But it makes for a nice contrast in colors on the photo. So that's one of the things I like about them. Well, thank you all for your patience. Susan, you want to jump back in? I think, Susan, to answer your question, I think production data is equally useful for a flock of any size. And NSIP, NSIP can be a great tool to benchmark what your production is. So I do think it is equally as useful, but it's like any scenario. If you've got 100 ewes or 10 ewes, you can make a lot more genetic progress with 100 ewes. But the tools are the same, and how you use them would be the same.
So for small flock owners, if say they work together, like 5, 6, 7 flocks or herds, they would increase the accuracy and the usefulness of NSIP similar to a large flock. Would that be accurate?
Correct. Not as much, but and I hope you guys can hear it. Susan shows up on my speaker here, so hopefully it's not reverberating back. But definitely a large flock just has that many more numbers where there's going to be more relevance. But by working together, and that's one of the big keys with developing contemporary groups, is sharing those genetics and in appropriate numbers or in appropriate quantities. So they can still make some relevant information, but it won't be as relevant as the larger flocks. Rick, I think that ram looks familiar to you, and I don't know what I never did. He grew up in California, so I never did take a lamb scrotal circumference on him, and obviously he's in season in that photo. I don't have time to dig through all of my numbers here to find his information, though. Yes, that's Wilbur. For full disclosure, everybody, Rick AI'd some to that ram this last year.
Do we have any more questions?
Lisa has an excellent point that identifying the bottom performers is one of the really big keys or big ways you can use the tool. I'm sorry, Bill, I didn't follow you. Are you saying that by a number of breeders using that ram, they actually did a good job of tying in genetic connectedness with a ram that's now dead because they eyed with him? And Bill, we're all watching you, waiting for you to type.